Hey students and family members, it's Mr. Panza. Today we are discussing this main question. How do we compare unlike fractions? What we mean by that specifically is when you have a denominator that is not the same. For example, if you had 1/2 and you wanted to see if that was greater than, less than, or equal to 3/7, you cannot just compare them. You can't add them or subtract them either because they do not have common denominators. The denominator, or the number down below, 2, is different than the denominator down below, 7. It is a difficult question, especially when you start thinking about how we can attack it. And you've got to go through these 5 steps. One thing I found most successful for my students was taking these 5 steps, putting them on a whiteboard so that you can successfully answer all questions like this. Let's review the steps now. Step 1 is check for a common denominator. If these two did have a common denominator, for example, let's say instead of 1/2 it was 1/7 compared to 3/7, you wouldn't have to do steps 2, 3, or 4. You could skip right down to step 5 because the way you compare any whole number or fraction is, in this case, comparing the numerators to see which one is bigger, which would tell me that 3/7 is larger than 1/7. And because that's the case, my hungry alligator would eat 3/7. However, we have an issue. These denominators are not the same, which means I cannot skip right to 5, and I must go to step 2. List the multiples. Then list the multiples of the second number. That means I'm taking the number 2, and I'm skip counting by 2. And then I'm taking the number 7, and I'm skip counting by 7. Finally, I create equivalent fractions, which is what we learned last week, and then I'm able to compare the numerators of the brand new fractions with common denominators and go from there. Here's the example spelled out for you. The problem I have with this specific example is there's just too much going on here. So what I did is I showed the students how to take this type of work, use the 5 steps correctly, and still be able to answer the questions. Let me show you how they do that now. In a worksheet we practiced here at school, we have all of these steps written on the side. You're going to see me use letter G, take these 5 steps, and create equivalent fractions or comparable fractions with common denominators. So the first thing I showed students how to do is take 3/4 and put it in the upper left-hand corner of our whiteboard. I'm comparing that to 6/8, so I put 6/8 in the upper right-hand corner of my whiteboard. Step 1, when I'm trying to compare fractions, is check to see if the denominators are the same. Well, 4 is not the same to 8, so they're not common, which means I cannot just skip to step 5. Instead, I go to step 2. Step 2 says list the multiples of the first denominator. Well, here's the first denominator, 4. We learned in our estimation unit that multiples are many, and you can skip count by that number through infinity. In this case, I'm going to skip count by 4 to see the first few multiples of 4. So if I remember my skip counting songs, it's 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. I'm going to stop there. You don't even need to list the first 10 multiples. Just list the first few multiples, and that's step 2. Step 3 is the same exact thing except with the other denominator, 8. Listing the multiples of the second denominator, 8, would look and sound like this. 8, 16, 24, 32. And you could stop right there for a couple of reasons. First of all, I notice at least 2 common denominators. My 8 and my 8, which would mean I wouldn't have to change 6/8. Or if you're like me, you see this 16 to the 16. Once you notice that 16 is a common denominator that can be used for these fractions, you're done with step 3 and ready to move on to step 4. In our previous lessons, we learned how to take fractions like 3/4 and create equivalent fractions, which is a fraction that looks different in math form but covers the same amount of space. So, I need to take 3/4 and create an equivalent fraction with a brand new denominator of 16. So 4 is going to change to 16. These types of questions the students approached last week in our other lessons. They were able to see that 4 increased or got larger. And when you are increasing a number in fraction form, you are multiplying that number. It's 4 times something will get me 16. In this case, if you don't know that 4 times 4 is 16, one strategy I taught the students was to take 16, divide it by 4 to determine what you actually multiplied by. In this case, it is 4, which gets me my 16. Because I'm creating an equivalent fraction, the only rule the students were taught is whatever you do to the denominator must be applied to the numerator. Change the bottom using multiply or divide, and the same to the top must be applied. What that means is, because we divided or multiplied, in this case by 4, I have to do the same exact thing to the numerator, 4 times 3, which is going to give me a brand new fraction which looks different than 3/4 but is equivalent at 12/16. I'm not done quite yet. Remember, I need to compare fractions, and I can't compare fractions with uncommon denominators. Well, this is a denominator of 16, and this is a denominator of 8. We know, however, that the denominator must be 16. And from last week, we know that to create a common denominator that increased from 8 to 16, they must have multiplied. And if you didn't know that they multiplied by 2, you could have divided 16 by 8 to get 2, which tells you what to do then to the numerator. 6 times 2 is 12. Now in this case, I'm done with the first 4 steps. We've created equivalent fractions, and I can compare the numerators. The hungry alligator will eat the bigger number. In this case, 12 is my numerator, and 12 is my numerator. So, these are equal. This is an equivalent fraction. 3/4 is equal to 12/16, and 6/8 is equal to 12/16. And when I compare these fractions, that means 3/4 and 6/8 are equivalent fractions. What the students have done here at school is taken this type of problem and put it on their whiteboards, just like this. Now that we've broken it down, found a common denominator, just like I showed you, the students are able to recognize that we multiplied by different numbers. Over here we multiplied by 4, which means we needed to do 3 times 4, which gives me 12. And over here we multiplied by 2, which means I needed to do the same to the 6, which gives me 12. So even on a whiteboard, it works the same exact way, using the same exact steps, showing me that these fractions, 6/8 and 3/4, are equivalent fractions. I hope this video helps as you continue to practice it at home or here in school.